Welcome back to another episode of Deep Quotes. I'm Dee.
I'm Pod.
And today we have another quote from Sonalee Rashatwar. This one should be a fun one. It's, "You can't call it feminist art if there aren't any fat people in your body of work." And subtext of that, she had a post along with the image that said, "Your work isn't actually pushing boundaries if it's not including marginalized black, brown, indigenous, disabled, fat, trans bodies." I'm guessing she meant to include an "or" in there.
Hopefully.
But we'll discuss it both ways, whether or not it has an "or" in it. So, where to start?
Well, I guess since you just brought up the whole missing conjunction there, let's talk about that subtext without the "or." So that's saying that
you need to include someone who is black, brown, indigenous, disabled, fat, and trans. And if you don't, and you don't find that particular person, that you're not pushing boundaries if they're not being included. This is, I don't think, defensible, because pushing boundaries, there are many boundaries that you can push with artwork. And even just limited to feminist artwork, you can push many different boundaries. Saying your work isn't pushing boundaries implies not pushing a single boundary if it doesn't include this. You can push other boundaries whether or not you include this. So I think that this is just logically farcical from the get-go.
And just like from the perspective of, let's call that "and" at the end. I don't personally know anyone who meets all of those qualifications.
Saying "and" doesn't make it easier.
Yeah, it doesn't make any logical sense. So, but like, it would definitely be the token person if you did find such a unicorn to be like, hey, you are half black and also half indigenous to whatever area you're producing the work. And also disabled, and also fat, and also trans, and that one would be hard to meet.
Right, and the ones that she listed is not a completely inclusive list of all types of minorities out there. So she's excluding some minorities while trying to say, oh, you aren't pushing boundaries unless you include all of these minorities. But in actually creating a list, she's excluding other minorities for arbitrary reasons and saying that you need to include all of these minorities because we need to include minorities. But then she's excluding minorities, which goes against her own point. And even if you say, or it has to be one of these, you're still making a list. And when you make a list, unless you have a complete list and include every type of minority, you are necessarily excluding people. And she's complaining about the exclusion of certain types of people. And then she went ahead and excluded types of people. And if it's an "and," yeah, finding a black, indigenous, disabled, fat, trans person, it's like, wow, let's just try and label a particular individual that we can find that will win the Victim Olympics. Who is the most victimized person? And you must include that type of a person in order to push any boundaries. Now, maybe the boundaries that she views as important, but making the claim of pushing any boundaries is logically false.
I mean, to be fair, this last quote that we're taking is at the end of a fairly long rant that we did not include here, talking about the importance of having super fat and Infinifat bodies and not just skinny people. Those are, by the way, real terms that she uses. I am not making these up.
You can look at her social media. You have enough information to go Google her. But I think let's focus on the primary post and not her diatribe. The primary post being what we have on screen. You can't call it feminist art if there aren't any fat people in your body of work. So an important qualifier is that last statement of "in your body of work." So it's not to say a particular art piece, but if you are making feminist art, somewhere in that art has to include a fat person.
Somewhere. Even if you make 100 paintings and only one of them has a person who maybe possibly looks chunky, does that count?
So technically that would count, but in her defense, she's trying to create a bite-size quote to say, hey, here's something that I feel, and she's not really going for the logical qualifications and everything to be perfect. So I think we're being a little unfair in that regard.
What's the test for movies for feminists? What's
the Bechdel test?
The Bechdel test. Yeah, this feels very Bechdel test of like.
Where is there anywhere in your for those that aren't familiar, the Bechdel test is there any instance where there are two female characters having a conversation with each other and they are discussing something besides the male a male character?
They have to be named.
Yes,
talking to each other.
And I think the Bechdel test is a good comparison because there's a pretty bad movie out there called Death Race 2050. And it's a parody movie, bad acting, low production quality. It's really not that great. But one of the scenes, they have several of the female named characters that were playing primary roles. And throughout the rest of the movie, they're fairly heavily sexualized. But they walk up to a bar and grab a drink, and you see labeled on the bar, it's called the Bechdel Bar. And they just discuss some politics and some science, and don't bring up male characters at all. So technically speaking, Death Race 2050 meets the requirements of the Bechdel test, making it a feminist film according to that definition. And so this oversimplified definition that Sonalee is giving us is equivalent to the Bechdel test, in which case I will make one image of a fat, black, indigenous, disabled, trans, add on as many minority qualifications as you can, one image, and then technically I meet her qualifications as a feminist artist.
And like similar to that with Death Race 2050, like isn't the whole thing in that movie that people are going around killing each other, and I think killing women gets you more points.
Yeah, that they're rating how many points you get based, like, for killing people based on their characteristics, like, whether or not they're
running them over
female, male, young, old, disabled. It changes their point value, and I don't think that that's what she had intended. But technically speaking, that is a movie that meets the Bechdel test, and it means that it's more feminist than a lot of other,
I think Star Wars. Or the original one didn't.
I think the original Star Wars failed. Yeah. So passing the Bechdel test does not make it a good movie or a feminist movie. So, but back to the quote to kind of bring it back in. You have to include fat people. So feminist, depending on what type of feminist she's talking about, feminism is the belief that women should be treated equally to men.
That's a fair... possibly oversimplification, but fair definition.
Yes, that women are not inferior to men and that they should be treated equally. That's what feminism is. There are variations of that in various extremes. There are feminists that say all men are bad. That's a different type of feminism. But in terms of we want equality for women and we want to represent that equality for women. Okay. Is it fair to require that fat people are included in that? Because she said fat people, not fat women. But she's implying that fat is an inherent characteristic of women, and to an extent she's right. Women tend to be fatter than men, and a healthy woman is fatter than a healthy man.
Yeah, it is. When you look at body fat percentage charts, it's about 10 percentage points higher for women than for men. So a healthy woman...
At the low end.
Yeah. Well, actually, at the low end, at the high end as well.
Okay, right.
So, like, a healthy woman, generally speaking, is going to be between about 15 to 30, up to maybe 40% body fat. Beyond that, and that's when you start getting into a
questionable area.
You probably ought to be losing some weight for medical reasons.
So, generally speaking, between about 10 and 30% for females.
15 and
30%.
15 and 30 to 40-ish.
Approximately.
It depends on body type and age and stuff.
And for men, it's a little bit lower. It's about 5% up to about 20%.
And again, with about a 10 percentage range of like 20 to 30, it kind of depends on what your genetics and your life goals are.
Sure, but for the men, the variation is 20 to 30. For women, it's 30 to 40. So and what do we mean by a healthy range? Because I think that she would probably contest this is, well, all bodies are healthy. No. Statistically speaking, the healthy weight range is determined by if you come down with some sort of medical affliction, or you have some deficiency, or just a medical problem in general, what weight ranges is it likely that you will need other ramifications or other medications to be able to alleviate your symptoms? So if you are below 10% body fat, or below 15% body fat, sorry, for a female, and you start having medical issues, maybe heart problems, vision problems, depression problems, chances are it's weight related, meaning that you're underweight. If you eat more, those symptoms will probably go away.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. You may have other issues that are going on. But in particular, it may just be that you are vitamin deficient and not calorie deficient. But in eating more, you get more calories, put on fat, and also get those vitamins. So it's that sort of thing that they are correlated. Similarly, overeating, you can have vitamin excesses, as well as just the problems that come with being overweight in terms of high cholesterol, heart disease, and all the other things that come with being overweight. So that's what we're using to determine what a healthy weight range is. That being said, the weight ranges are different, which is interesting because that means that men and women are inherently different in just how they're developed. A healthy weight range for a female requires more fat as percentage of body weight than a male does. What do you think that is?
I mean, well, I know what the answer,
like we're speculating, but to an extent.
I know mostly what the answer is.
Sure.
So part of it is that estrogen needs to exist in a fat-rich environment. Estrogen, of course, being the quote-unquote female hormone, which is necessary for doing things like having babies, which is
menstruating, or growing breasts,
having breasts, doing all of those things that we associate with female bodies, because at this point only female bodies can do those things. Versus men, well, males will be a little bit trans nicer.
We'll be specific.
Don't have that same estrogen requirement, and they have more of a testosterone requirement, which does not require, like, testosterone and estrogen do not exist well in the same system. So as your testosterone goes up, your estrogen needs to go down. So males need to have a lower body fat to counteract that.
Because increasing your estrogen production will mess with your hormone balance and mess with your mood in general. And this is something that shows itself or manifests itself as soy consumption increases, is that there actually is a correlation between eating soy and increased estrogen. So when you say that, oh, you're a soy drinker, you drink a bunch of soy lattes, there is some truth that if a male drinks a lot of soy lattes, they will tend to behave more femininely because there's likely increased estrogen in their body. It's also associated with fat, that it's easier for a male to have increased estrogen levels with fatter bodies. But because of that, their bodies have a natural balance that is a lower fat percentage than females. So going back to her quote, though, there needs to be fat people. And it's interesting that she didn't say fat women, because she's implying that to be fat is to be female, or that those are directly correlated, and that fat has to be included with anything supportive of women.
Well, she's also saying that because she's coming from the perspective of, you don't want to call someone a woman because that is identified as female and also female-bodied. It is a common thing to trace through her work, unfortunately.
Okay. But to be fair...
That her language becomes less precise.
Sure. But to be fair, then, including fat people, because fat is something that is associated with women, and historically it has been, that being overweight, or not overweight, but having excess amounts of fat means that you are better capable of caring for a baby, both in terms of producing milk as well as having the energy stores necessary for creating the baby, and it is a sign of health in that regard. So including fat people in your body of work is actually somewhat important, because a healthy woman is a woman with more fat on her than compared to a similarly proportioned male.
But that's not where her quote's necessarily coming from.
Not necessarily, but
Like,
regardless of where it's coming from.
Because she specifically calls out in her little diatribe that, like, oh, a single roll of fat is not enough fat to be considered fat.
I understand. And she's later on implying Infinifat is good and like seriously overweight is good. That's a completely different assertion than what's being made here, which is you should include fat people in your body of work if you are if you're saying that it's a feminist piece of art or that you're a feminist artist. And to an extent, that's fair because even historically, looking back to before the feminist movement, women were frequently presented in art as being fatter than men. It's now look at I'm trying to think of the example here. Not stereotypical male, but a male ideal.
Like David's Michelangelo. Or
Yep,
Michelangelo's David.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up.
David did not make Michelangelo.
Yeah, Michelangelo's statue of David. Very thin, very muscular, and not much fat on him. In contrast, if you look at some historical statues or just historical artistry, look at the statue of Venus. Now, yes, she is relatively thin. She's not overweight, but the body fat percentage on the statue of Venus is probably in the upper teens.
I would purport that it's closer to the low to mid 20s. But
she has some muscles showing, but there's a little bit of belly fat there. She has sizable breasts, and you need to have fat to be able to have that body type. So the statue of Venus, while slender and very, like, she's meant to be a female ideal, she's very attractive in terms of just what men are looking for.
Oh, that's sexist.
Males. You know what I mean? That the statue of Venus is something that we point to as female beauty, and she has a higher body fat percentage than the statue of David, which is supposed to be male beauty. Similarly, fertility statues, particularly of women, tend to be fat, that they accentuate fat in terms of breast size, belly size, butt size, because, again, having fat means that you have the resources to be able to produce and care for a child. So historically, yes, women have been associated with fat. So including fat people means that you are supporting what has historically been important to femininity. Now, on the flip side, though, being seriously overweight, like Infinifat, where you start dying of your own weight and that it's literally killing you, saying that that type of fat is good is very anti-feminist, because that means that women will be dying significantly earlier, and it's similar to wanting women to be unhealthy. And like, she is advocating for that in her diatribe next to the post, where yes, you should be very, very overweight, and that is feminist. And no, being very, very overweight is not feminist. That means that you're encouraging women to be unhealthy, which is anti-woman, because if you're an unhealthy woman, you're more likely to die. So encouraging unhealthy behaviors is anti-feminist, but being accepting of and encouraging people to be okay with having fat on their bodies, sure. I think what she's trying to advocate for here is, if you only have artwork that portrays thin women and thin people, you're saying that fat people are unattractive. That if they aren't included, that means that you are implying something else. A lack of something implies support against it.
Yeah, well, specifically, like, and she does go into it in her diatribe, that if you are saying, like, oh, I'm making beauty, and you're completely missing any other form of beauty, then you are implying that only in her diatribe she talks about white supremacy and how if you only have conventionally attractive, skinny white girls,
then you're saying that only they can be attractive. And it's a common stance coming from the perspective of identity politics, that when your identity is paramount over the individual, the identities of that person. So whether or not they're fat, disabled, indigenous, black, the list that she made, if you don't include all of those, you are leaving out identities. And if the most important thing is that all identities of people are equal, then you need to include all identities equally. This is why frequently when people are looking for representation of minorities, they're looking not for equal representation in terms of the percentage of population. They're looking for an equal share. As a good example, I've seen black activists upset that The Bachelor took something like 13 seasons or 11 seasons or something along those lines to have a black bachelorette. Sorry, I think on the Bachelorette. It's like in the US where it's made, about 10% of the population is black. So it actually makes perfect sense that around 1 in 10 would be black, that you would do it by percentage. But I think in terms of identity politics, which is what she's mentioning in the end of her diatribe, which is the extra quote that we have, not just the image on the screen. There she's talking about identity politics and saying that these all need to be represented equally and not just proportionally.
Well, not necessarily equally, but that these need to be prominently represented, or things that you can easily find. Except when you're looking at like, well, okay, let's take the easy one here and look at trans.
Sure, I think that it's something like 0.5% on the high end if you're being generous.
Some number less than 1%. It may be slightly higher than that if you include people that have interesting identities that are not necessarily...
In terms of people that actually identify as, I am male biologically and I identify as a woman, I want to say it's like 1 in 1,000.
Yeah.
And that's
I was
from,
using the interesting to refer to the 13-year-olds who are still trying to find themselves.
Sure. But regardless, we're talking of fractions of a percent, and even from some of the more some reasonable feminist groups, it's a couple of percent. Okay, fine. Let's call it 5%. That's 1 in 20 people are trans. I think most people would agree that that's a ridiculous claim unless you're living in the inner city and all you're exposed to is this type of culture and you don't see any other part of the world. But whatever, 1 in 20. Are you saying that in order to get fair representation, you need to have at least 1 in every 20 people that are presented anywhere, including in feminist art, are trans? Because that's what proportional representation would look like. And I don't think that that's necessarily what she's arguing for. At least similar arguments, or at least parts of her argument that were made in this diatribe is basically saying that it's not proportional. It has to be included regardless of the percentage. If I have 5 works of art, one of them has to include someone that's fat. That's 20% of what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if she's making the same claim with black people and indigenous people, indigenous are far less common than all the other types.
It depends on where you live, but
it depends on where you live, sure. But in the United States, indigenous people are not very common, at least compared to the majority, which is white. Even black, which is one of the largest minorities, is about 10% of the population. I think it's actually 13, but somewhere around there, that they tend to actually frequently be overrepresented, particularly in films, in terms of proportionality. So requiring a certain proportionality for your work to be considered valid feminist art is her particular version of what feminism should be. She has every right to express that, and I think it's important that she does express that opinion, because there are people that would say we should only be making art of what we believe is beautiful, which, while she should be making her claims to pull art and pull feminist expression in the direction that she believes is right, I have no problem with that, because that's what everyone else on the other side of the argument is doing. They're trying to pull it towards their side of the argument. And art should be a representation of the world, which is what she's claiming here, that you should represent the world. On the flip side of that coin, art should represent an ideal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm also just imagining her seeing someone follow her advice and include infinifats and superfats in their body of work, only to realize that, oh, it kind of looks like a caricature, especially if you're doing more of a cartoony drawing.
Well, and also...
And like, so is that really actually helping if you're drawing someone in a way that could be taken as disparaging?
Could be taken offensively, right. But even beyond that, if you are making art with a particular means, it's not just an expression or I feel this way and I want to make this. If you're making art as political art and to pull a culture towards a certain direction, you are trying to achieve a goal. If the majority of the population feels that fat people in art, like Infinifat people is what we're referring to. Again, this is her word. If you include very overweight and Infinifat people in your works of art, you are likely to alienate the majority of the population. And even a lot of minorities that don't find that attractive, and they want to look at artwork as a source of an ideal or an expression of an ideal, including those types of things that are more fringe things and not showing a goal to try to attain, you're going to alienate them. And they'll also be less attracted to the rest of your work because, well, this piece I really don't like. I don't really care to look at more of their pieces because why would you try to make this piece of art? So it may actually turn people away from your art, making you as an artist less effective at pulling the culture. That to be able to sway the culture, you need to be identifiable with as many types of people as possible, which, yes, will include people that are fat and include people that are overweight. But you can make art where you're expressing someone that is thin, and fat people can still find that attractive. As if I'm overweight and I want to go back to being a healthy weight, or underweight and want to be a healthy weight, I can look at these ideals in art and aspire to become that. There's nothing wrong with aspiring to a particular piece of art or making art that people can aspire to. The problem doesn't come from the art. The problem comes from the requirement that everyone looks like a piece of art. And I think that that's what she should be focusing on here, is not the type of art that's produced, but how we react to the art.
Well, I think also, like, I think that she does take it a little too far with the diatribe that you guys can listen to, or not listen to. Read on your own. Is that she's specifically talking about the superfat and infinifat groups, where it's like, okay, I could get behind this quote if you're talking about, like, hey, please remember to use, like, realistic proportions for people, and remember that there are organs inside of female bodies.
Sure.
And that you maybe possibly should, like, make bodies with a 25% body fat, which is a more realistic thing for most people to achieve, as opposed to, you look at, like, Tim Burton's work, and it's like, you people would just
die.
You would just die.
Tim Burton characters are notorious for not being practical, but that's not the point. It's an expression of art, not necessarily of an ideal.
But like, I'm pointing it out from the perspective of, like, there is a lot of artists that use that type of
absolutely, it's their own form
model,
of expression.
And then that becomes very mainstream, that, like, oh, you're talking very, very thin. You know, all the Disney princesses are impossibly thin, with the exception, I think, of Moana. I think she actually does have enough body.
Yes. Also, the girl from Brave.
Yeah. Merida, I believe.
Something like that.
But for the most part, historically, Disney has been really bad at this.
But again, they're free to say, like, princesses and royalty are supposed to be people that we can look up to.
Well, there's looking up to, and then there's, like, girl, you would be fainting right about now. Okay. So yes, but they're trying to push the idea that thin is good and that it's beautiful, and they may go a little bit too far in pulling towards that direction. So Disney princesses, with a couple of exceptions, Moana being one, the creators of that art are pulling too far in the direction of thin to try and bring people to say, hey, being thin is healthy. On the flip side, Sonalee is saying people should be overweight. Yeah,
and
she's pulling
towards a fairly unrealistic Right.
On the bad side.
A fairly unrealistic side on the bad side. But my point is, she is, in that case, just as in error as the ideology that she's saying is bad. That she's saying thin culture and saying you must be thin to be attractive is bad. Well, that's one extreme, because they're not saying you must only be thin. We're saying that, oh, this thin extreme is attractive. So they're pushing an extreme. She's pushing an extreme on the other side. And it's just as invalid as the other side of the extreme that she's purporting to be against. Both of the extremes are bad. Mm-hmm. And she's just pulling on the opposite extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was simply advocating for, like, let's find the happy medium, guys.
Sure, find the happy medium. And there are always going to be people out on the edges. Mm-hmm. And so, again, in her defense, I think that she is pulling from the opposite end of the spectrum towards the hyper thin ideologies, the types of things that models will starve themselves to try and get their bodies as close down to that. A good example of this is, if you've ever watched White Christmas, the main actress in that has an impossibly thin, or nearly impossibly thin, waist. Like, it was uncomfortable to see just how thin her waist was and how thin she was. So that's from the other extreme.
And, like, she actively had anorexia during the filming of that movie, I believe. She had a BMI down like 16. Yeah. It was painful to watch.
So, but there will always be people on the extremes, because your extreme, the size of your spectrum is defined by the most extreme people. So there will always be people on the edge. Where that edge is will change. And what I would argue is that the people that are advocating only thin is attractive are just as wrong as the people like Sonalee that are saying only fat is attractive, or you must include fat to be able to express what is attractive. So both extremes, there will always be extremes that exist. Both extremes are wrong. There's a balance that needs to be found. But I think that what she's trying to do, at least with this is a good example of, is pulling in the opposite direction of what she views as a problem. She thinks it's that the happy medium is more on the fat side and a wider spectrum than the typical historical expression where fat is okay, but within a certain health range. You don't want to be too skinny, don't want to be too fat. There's a certain smaller range. I think that she's advocating for increasing the range and pulling it more towards the fat end, particularly because that's what we most frequently have a problem with in first world cultures, is overeating rather than undereating, which is why being overweight or being very fat has historically been a sign of wealth. It's no longer anymore. And I think that what she's saying is, as the culture changes, we need to change with the culture. And that means that as we get fatter, we should pull beauty standards towards the fat end of the spectrum. I think that's what she's doing with this quote. Mm-hmm. Now, the other part is identity politics and having to include everyone. And she's necessarily excluding minorities when trying to create a list of minorities. So she's going against what she's saying. Mm-hmm. The second part of that quote, which is the last piece of her diatribe, is just farcical. But the first part, somewhat fair. Yes, fat is associated with female bodies, which means that she's also, in making that statement, she's saying that females are inherently different than males, and that fat is connected inherently with the female body type, which means that women are different than men, or females are different than males. So that many people would consider that anti-feminist.
Yeah, the quote by itself, without the supporting diatribe, is definitely a fair quote. I wouldn't say that it is a great quote, just that it is fair.
It's defendable.
It's defendable. And then when you include the diatribe and realize that her definition,
what she's coming from may not be as valid, but this particular area, it's like, okay, what she's expressing is that she wants to see art that is more inclusive of fat body types, which means that she thinks that art should be an expression of culture, an expression of reality. And I think a lot of other people would say art should not be an expression of reality. It should be an interpretation of reality, potentially based in reality. But also it could be an expression of an ideal, in which case many different people can hold different ideals. She holds an ideal of everyone being Infinifat, and most people don't share that ideal, but she wants more people to share it. So she's advocating for her extreme position.
And she is more than welcome to do that. And if she wants to make me just about 100,000 cookies so that I will too become Infinifat,
I will be happy to eat some of the cookies.
but otherwise I will choose not.
All right, well, see, now I'm getting hungry for cookies, and I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up. So thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time.
Hi everyone! Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.